Alla Tulia Meldonya Aharamari essay. My name's Rainbow Dave and welcome to this third video in our series about the Lords of Beleriand in the First Age of Middle-earth. So in the last video I talked all about the return of the Noldor, and in the video before that I talked about the indigenous Dark Elves of Beleriand and their High King Eleuthingol. Now in this video we are going to see these two strands come together, because the time has come for the princes of the Noldor and a princess to finally meet King Eleuthingol, the self-appointed Lord of Beleriand. The worlds of Calaquendi and Moraquendi are about to collide. Now, I've already talked a lot about the House of Theanor, aka his sons, and I've also talked a lot about the House of Fingolfin, but today I'm going to take a bit of a break from them, at least at first, and instead focus on the House of Narafine, the third son of the old High King Finwë. Now, if you've seen the Feanor videos, you'll know that Narafine did not accompany his brothers to Middle-earth, and instead he took up the Noldorine throne in Valinor, where he rules forever, peacefully in paradise, away from the drama of the story. Seriously, few guys have as great a life as Narafine. But, very importantly, Narafine's golden-haired children, they did not stay with him. All of them travelled to Middle-earth with their uncle Fingolfin. But while Fingolfin and his sons and his daughter set up their settlement in the realm of Mithrim in the northwest, Narafine's 5 children pretty immediately wandered off into the south to explore the unknown lands of Beleriand. So that is where we're going to pick up the story today. But just before I begin properly, I know I said Narafine's 5 children, but that's actually quite a controversial statement. If you flick through the Silmarillion right to the very end, you'll find a family tree of the Noldor. And on that family tree, it very explicitly shows Narafine's 5 children. However, Christopher Tolkien himself has actually stated that this may be a mistake. You see, Professor J.R.R. Tolkien, he spent so much of his life drafting and redrafting the Legendarium, but then he died, and most of it wasn't published yet. So there are a few cases where things don't always line up. In Tolkien's latest writings, he decided that the second son of Narafine, that's Orodreth, was actually the grandson of Narafine, and thus the son of Angerod. And this is most likely what Professor Tolkien intended by the end of his life, but it's not what's written in the bulk of his works. Although, to be 100% honest, Orodreth really doesn't matter for the purposes of this video, and it makes very little difference whether he's a brother or a nephew of Narafine's other children, so I'll let you guys decide whatever you want on that one. But for the purposes of this video, there are actually only 3 children of Narafine that I'm going to talk about. First is the eldest son, Finrod. Second is the middle son, Angerod. And last is the youngest and most famous of all Narafine's children, Galadriel. So keep these 3 in your mind. Anyway, it is Prince Angerod who becomes the first of the Noldor to meet King Eleuthingol and his Maya wife, Mellyn. And Angerod is sent into the woodland realm of Doriath as a messenger on behalf of his eldest brother, Finrod. However, as you may remember from the first video in this series, Thingol's kingdom is protected by a magical boundary, a sort of force field of shadows and bewilderment called the Girdle of Mellyn. And so, the moment Angerod steps into Doriath, Mellyn and Thingol instantly become aware of him. Now, Tolkien tells us that any other Noldor in exile would not be suffered to pass within the confines of Doriath, as Thingol blames the Noldor for Morgoth's return. Which is kind of fair enough, to be honest, but Angerod and his siblings are a very interesting exception. And the reason for this boils down to their parentage. So, obviously, Narafine is the father of his children, but their mother is an elf maiden called Eärwen. And Eärwen isn't one of the Noldor at all. She is a 100% Tellarine princess of Alqualondë. Her father is Olwë, the High King of the Teleri in Valinor. And if you remember, Olwë is the younger brother of the Telleri's original High King, Elwë, aka Eleuthingol. So this means that through their mother Eärwen, Eleuthingol is actually the great uncle of Finrod, Angerod, and Galadriel. They are his kin. And so, for that reason alone, Angerod is allowed to pass the girdle of Melian, and he eventually comes to Doriath's capital of Menegroth. Now, we're told that Angerod spoke long with the king, and he told him all about the deeds of the Noldor and the size of their force and the now mended divisions that existed between the sons of Theanor and the House of Fingolfin. But it's here that we see a potential for things to get real awkward. Because you no doubt remember that the story of how the Noldor ended up in Beleriand in the first place does involve an unfortunate amount of kinslaying. Now, I talked all about that in this video, but basically when Theanor acquired the ships that he used to sail to Middle-earth, he did so by straight up murdering a whole bunch of Teleri. Teleri of Alqualondë. Teleri under the protection of Olwë, and before that of Eleuthingol himself. And of course, one of the great tragedies of this kinslaying is that Feanor's sons, as well as Fingolfin himself, albeit without really knowing what he was doing, took part in the slaughter. So it's not unreasonable to presume that Thingol might be pissed if he ever learned what the exiled Noldor had done. Now, we do know that the children of Finarfin had no part in the kinslaying. In fact, in most versions of the story, Galadriel actually fought against Feanor in defense of her mother's kin. But even so, the whole kinslaying business might be a detail to leave out, considering the Noldor are now refugees in Thingol's realm. And Angerod does leave it out, although Tolkien makes a point of stating that he doesn't do so out of deceit or manipulation or anything like that. Angerod simply believes, perhaps naively, all griefs now forgiven. So when Angerod leaves Doriath and he returns to the rest of the Noldor in Mithrim, he does so as Thingol's personal spokesman. And he passes on the message that although the Noldor are free to establish realms in the empty lands outside of Doriath, and although the Sindar and the Noldor are sort of allies against Morgoth, they're not exactly friends. And that's kind of just how things go for the first 20 years of the Noldor's exile in Beleriand. But Fingolfin, the High King of the Noldor and an all-round wonderful dude, he knows that the Elves of Middle-earth will need more than just a tentative alliance if they are going to survive and thrive against the might of Morgoth. So, Fingolfin decides to hold a great feast called the Mereth Adderthad, the Feast of Reuniting. And the whole point of this feast is to bring together all the peoples of Beleriand in peace and celebration, to learn from each other and to strengthen their bonds of fellowship. And the Mereth Adderthad is a really nice event. Obviously, Fingolfin and his children, they are all present, and so is Finrod and presumably the rest of his siblings. But we're also told that Maedhros and Maglor arrive with their warriors from the ever-cold east, representing the sons of Theanor. And in addition to the Noldor, there also came great numbers of the Grey Elves. There came folk of the Havens with Kierdan, their lord, remember him? And also the Green Elves from Osiriand, the Laiquendi, who live in the distant south of Beleriand. And as I say, this feast is a really good time. Goodwill is sown amongst all the different types of elves, and it's at the Mereth Adderthad that the Noldor become fluent in the Sindarin language of the Grey Elves. You see, Tolkien actually tells us that apparently it's much easier for the Noldor to learn the language of the natives than it is for the Sindar to learn Quenya. Anyway, there is one elven lord who remains conspicuously absent from the Mereth Adathad, and that is, of course, Elw Thingol himself. In fact, from all of Doriath, only 2 individuals attend the feast. One is an elf called Mablung of the Heavy Hand. He is the captain of Thingol's army, and also effectively the captain of Thingol's guards. Now, Mablung is a dude we'll see again in the future. He's a really, really great character, but now is not the time for a tangent, so I'll leave Mablung for another video. Anyway, the other elf from Doriath is a guy called Dairon. And to be honest, Dairon is less of a great character, but he was a lore master and he was an all-round genius who was very close with Elw Thingol's family. And, fun fact about Dairon, he is one of, if not the greatest musician in all of Middle-earth. And even more than that, he's the one who invented the Kierth alphabet, better known as dwarf runes. So there you go, whenever you see dwarven writing anywhere in the Legendarium, it was actually this elf, Dairon, who invented them. Anyway, I think the fact that Elw Thingol didn't attend himself, or at least didn't send more than just 2 guys, is a bit of an insult, and a reminder that Thingol really doesn't care too much for the newly arrived Noldor. But, as grumpy as Thingol may occasionally be, that does not ruin the good time of the Mereth Adathad. And as Tolkien tells us that after the feast, the hearts of the Noldor were high and full of hope, and there followed after long years of peace. However, I guess peace and tranquility are not quite the same thing, and in this instance, we do very much get one without the other. Because although Morgoth is locked away inside Angband doing his own thing, which I'll talk about towards the end of this video, the conflict between Elw Thingol and the exiled Noldor is about to grow tenfold. And in our real world, there's a famous saying that I believe is often attributed to the Buddha, and I think it applies remarkably well to this part of the Legendarium. It goes like this: there are 3 things that cannot remain long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. And so, this is where 2 of the most powerful women in all of Tolkien's writings come to the forefront. And because of their interactions, the truth is finally revealed. So, as I've already said, Elw Thingol declared that only the children of his niece Eärwen are welcome in his kingdom. And of course, Eärwen's most famous child is Galadriel. So, along with her brothers, Galadriel comes to Thingol's capital of Menegroth, but unlike her brothers, she actually stays here for a really long time. And in Menegroth, Galadriel develops a close bond with her great aunt, Mellyn. Now, I feel like because there's so many different clans of elves in this story, it can sometimes be easy to forget that Mellyn is not an elf. She is a Maiar. She is of the same race as the Balrog and of Sauron. But unlike both of those guys, Mellyn is a thoroughly good person. And we're told that she and Galadriel have these long conversations about Valinor and the bliss of old. But we're also told that whenever Galadriel recounted the story of what brought the Noldor to Beleriand, she stopped at the dark hour of the death of the trees. Just like her brother Angerod, Galadriel is unwilling to spill the beans on the rest of the Noldor and reveal the truth of the kinslaying. But as I've already said, Mellyn is one of the most powerful beings in Middle-earth. And although her power doesn't manifest in what we might consider conventional power, she doesn't blast beams of Maiar juice at her enemy, she's not Captain Marvel or Wonder Woman, but she is one of the absolute wisest characters in the entire Legendarium. In fact, the only other character on her level is Gandalf. And he's got a whole other thing going on. So anyway, the point of what I'm saying is that Mellyn is not a person you can lie to. and she immediately perceives that Galadriel isn't telling the whole truth. Now, at this point in the Silmarillion, there's some really meaty dialogue between Mellyn and Galadriel, and we don't get a huge amount of dialogue in the Silmarillion, so I'm going to have to just read a little bit of it, because Tolkien has a pretty incredible way of building tension here. So, Mellyn says, "Why will you not tell me more?" And Galadriel says, "For that woe is past, and I would take what joy is left here." Which, to be honest, that sounds like a bit of a cheeky way of dodging the question. But Mellyn looks into her eyes and she says, "I believe not that the Noldor came forth as messengers of the Valar, as was said at first. For they speak never of the Valar, nor have their high lords brought any message to Thingol, whether from Manwë or Ulmo, or even from Olwë, the king's brother. For what cause, Galadriel, were the high people of the Noldor driven forth as exiles? What evil lies on the sons of Theanor? Do I not strike near the truth?" "Near," said Galadriel, "save that we were not driven forth, but came of our own will, and against that of the Valar." So, after just a little bit of interrogating from Mellyn, Galadriel does eventually tell the story of the Silmarils and their theft by Morgoth and the murder of the High King Finwë, who, if you recall, was once best friends with Thingol, way back when he was known as Elwë. But still, Galadriel does not reveal the truth about the Oath of Theanor, the burning of the ships, or the kinslaying at Alqualondë, which I think is actually a testament to Galadriel's integrity, because remember, she had nothing to do with any of those events, and when it comes to the ship burning and the kinslaying, she was actually on the side of the victims. Anyway, Mellyn still isn't fooled. She says, "Much you tell me, and yet more I perceive," but she and Galadriel speak on the subject no more. So Mellyn does exactly what you'd expect, and she goes to her husband Thingol to fill him in on what she's learned about the Noldorin exiles. And Mellyn and Thingol have an interesting conversation about the sons of Theanor. Mellyn says, "Beware the sons of Theanor. The shadow of the wrath of the Valar lies upon them, and they have done evil, I perceive, both in Aman and to their own kin." But Thingol doesn't respond to this news in the way you might expect. I just said that he was once best friends with Finwë, and I think the fact that the sons of Theanor were, at least in part, motivated by the death of their grandfather, it actually enamors Thingol towards them just a little bit. He says to his wife that of Theanor's sons I hear little to my pleasure, yet they are likely to prove the deadliest foes of our foe. And to this Mellyn responds with one of the most layered and foreboding lines in the entire story. "Their swords and their counsels shall have two edges." And that's it. That's all she has to say on the matter. Until one day. So in this video, I've talked a lot about the Sindar and the Noldor, but one guy that I've not mentioned much is Morgoth. Time to change that. Tolkien tells us that it was not long before whispered tales began to pass among the Sindar concerning the deeds of the Noldor ere they came to Beleriand. And I'll give you one guess on where these rumours came from. We are told that the evil truth was enhanced and poisoned by lies, and Morgoth specifically singled out the Sindar to receive the first assault of his malice. It seems that the Dark Lord was hoping to manipulate the High Elves and the Dark Elves into fighting each other on his behalf, and it could have worked. Kinslaying is something the Noldor have done before, and without wanting to give away spoilers, it's something they'll do again. But not this time. And the reason that the Elves of Beleriand are spared from the manipulation of Morgoth comes down to the wisdom of one of my all-time favourite characters ever, Kierdan the Shipwright. So I've already gushed all about how great Kierdan is in previous videos, But in this moment he demonstrates his humility and his wisdom once again. You see, Kierdan hears these rumours about the evil deeds of the Noldor, and they trouble him, for he perceived swiftly that true or false, they were put about through malice. So instead of fueling the rumour mill as a lesser elf might, Kierdan sends messengers right away to Elu Thingol to warn him about what he's heard. And it just so happens that at the same time Kierdan's messengers come to Thingol, Galadriel's brothers are also in Doriath visiting her. So, conveniently, all the children of Finarfin are gathered in one place when the time comes for Thingol's judgment. And the guy who receives the brunt of Thingol's blame is, I think very unfairly, Finrod, the eldest of Galadriel's brothers. Now, the main reason that Thingol is upset with Finrod is that Finrod obviously knew the truth about the kinslaying, and yet he didn't tell him, which I suppose from Thingol's perspective would seem kind of like lying through omission. But I'm going to have to defend Finrod here, because in this scene he demonstrates such virtuous characteristics that you just can't not like him. So first thing, and I've said this before, but I'll say it one more time, Finrod had absolutely nothing to do with the kinslaying, nor the oath, nor the burning of the ships. In fact, the only reason he left his father and his home in paradise, and also his wife, the love of his life by the way, it was to protect his friends and his people from the leadership of Theanor. Finrod, perhaps more so than any other exiled prince of the Noldor, has done nothing wrong. But he doesn't say that to Thingol. He doesn't make excuses. And that's because this guy is perhaps the most honourable, wonderful, and lovely guy in the entire Legendarium. I mean, that's obviously a huge statement. It's just my opinion. And to be 100% honest, I may not be the most objective person in the world when it comes to Finrod. I said a few videos ago that Kierdan was my joint #1 favourite elf ever, and Finrod is my other joint #1 favourite elf. But in my defence, the reason I like Finrod so much is because he's such an utterly delightful dude. We'll see a lot more of it later, but even in this exchange we see the integrity that just radiates from the guy. So Thingol says to Finrod, "I marvel at you, son of Eärwen, that you would come to the board of your kinsman thus red-handed from the slaying of your mother's kin, and yet say naught in defence, nor yet seek any pardon." And Finrod remains silent. He's been put in a bit of an awkward situation. On the one hand, he doesn't want to lie to his great-uncle Thingol, but on the other hand, there's no way he can defend himself with the truth without shifting at least some of the blame onto Fingolfin and his cousins, and Finrod is simply unwilling to do that. He would rather take the blame for something he didn't do than throw his loved ones under the bus. However, Finrod's brother, Angerod, he doesn't feel quite the same way. There was a moment a little earlier in the story where Caranthea the Dark, that's Feanor's angriest son, said some rather unpleasant things to the sons of Finarfin about running hither and thither, and about their mother being of other kin. And don't forget, Caranthea totally did take an active role in the kinslaying. He didn't speak out against the burning of the ships, and he proudly swore the oath of Theanor. So Angerod's probably thinking he doesn't owe this douchebag a thing. And in his heart, the words of Caranthea welled up again in bitterness. So Angerod just steps forward and he tells Thingol everything. Everything. The blood spilled at Alqualonde, the doom of Mandos, the treacherous crossing of the grinding ice, the Helcaraxe, and he calls the sons of Feanor straight up kinslayers and traitors. So, Thingol is not happy, but I think his reaction to the children of Finarfin is actually quite a reasonable one. He says, "Go now, for my heart is hot within me." But then he does immediately add words to the effect of, "But you guys can come back later because we're all kin and I'm not actually mad at you." What he says is, "You were ensnared in an evil that you did not aid. And he also goes on to say that he'll maintain a friendship with Fingolfin and his people, as although they did technically aid Theanor in the kinslaying, they didn't do so knowingly, and it's not like they haven't already suffered enough and bitterly atoned for their misdeeds. But there is one very specific punishment that Thingol enforces upon all of the Noldor. He says, "Never again shall be heard the tongue of those who slew my kin, nor in my realm shall it be spoken openly. All such who use it shall be held slayers of kin and betrayers unrepentant." So, Thingol basically outlaws the use of the Noldor's Quenya language. And on the one hand, this might not seem like that big of a deal, but bear with me here, because I think in the mind of a philologist like Tolkien, a linguist, this is a hugely significant declaration. Because by forbidding a people's language, you're basically dismantling the fabric of their culture. Language is at the heart of ethnic identity. There have been quite a few occasions in our real world where one language or another has been forbidden, and it's always within the context of intellectual conquest, and I guess what we might call conceptual colonialism. In the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, so really not that long ago, there was a thing called a Welsh Knot, which was basically a stick used in Welsh schools to beat children that spoke Welsh. It was a way of undermining Welsh culture and enforcing English supremacy. Furthermore, and I only learned this today doing my research, but up until 2005, Scottish Gaelic was banned from the educational system because, get this, it was one of the chief principal causes of barbarity and incivility. Isn't that nuts? Restricting any language from being spoken is a huge deal, and I think it's worth considering that when we look at the cultural differences between the elves who speak Sindarin and the elves who speak Quenya. And what effectively ends up happening is that the Noldorian exiles are forced to speak Sindarin on a daily basis, as the Sindar are told to shun any who speak Quenya. And so the Quenyan language begins to die out. And before long, it exists only as a language of law and ritual, kind of like what Latin is for us. So when I begin each video, I say, "Ala tulia meldonia a haramari esse," turns out, under Thingol's new law, I would be shunned as a betrayer of kin unrepentant, just for saying that. I don't know, maybe I'll say something in Sindarin at the beginning of next week's video. Anyway, I've talked an awful lot about Thingol and the princes of the Noldor, but this video is called The Battle of Glory, and I've yet to mention any kind of a battle. So, that's what I'm going to finish on, because while all of this internal drama is going on amongst the elves, Tolkien reminds us that the shadow, with a capital S, brooded in the north. And this line foreshadows the third great battle of Beleriand, the biggest one yet, the Dagor Aglareb. So, Morgoth is very much aware that his enemies have been somewhat neglecting him, and his spies had reported that the Noldor were wandering abroad with little thought of war. So, in the 60th year of the First Age, the Iron Mountains above Angband vomited flame. There were earthquakes in the north, and fire came from fissures in the earth. And after the flame and the earthquakes came the orcs. The words Tolkien uses to describe their onslaught into northern Beleriand are burst, thrust, and poured. And I think it's important to note that we aren't dealing with the sort of medieval battles that were common in real-world history, where two armies would meet on a designated field at the chosen time, and then they'd line up their shield walls and slowly advance in a relatively ordered manner. These orcs really don't have tactics. They simply spew from Angband as hosts of rampaging warbands, unleashing great evil wherever they go. However, although the orcs themselves don't have much in the way of strategic thought, Morgoth, at least, is an intelligent guy, and he split his army into 3 separate hosts. The first he sends west into Mithrim, into the land of High King Fingolfin and his sons. And the second host he sends east into the ever-cold wilderness ruled by the sons of Theanor, specifically the eldest sons Maedhros and Maglor. But neither the western nor the eastern host represent the bulk of Morgoth's army. The main host falls upon the central realm of Dorthonion. And I've not mentioned Dorthonion yet, I'll talk about it properly in the next video, but this highland forest is ruled by 2 of the sons of Narafine. Remember Angerod? He's one of them, and his younger brother Aegnor is the other. And Dorthonion is basically a buffer zone between the fortress of Morgoth and the rest of Beleriand, including Doriath. So, as long as Dorthonion remains in elven hands, Morgoth really can't conquer Beleriand. And that is exactly why the bulk of his orcs are sent there. But the truth is this: despite Morgoth's supposed intelligence, he has egregiously miscalculated the strength of the Noldor, and the extent to which they hate him. If you remember when I talked about the Dagor and Wingiliath, the Battle Beneath the Stars, in this video, I mentioned that the High Elves of Valinor, the Noldor, have great power of mind and body, and their skill as warriors goes way beyond anything that any orc rabble is capable of. So, when the orcs attack the west, they are met not only by Fingolfin's sons, Fingon and Turgon, both great warriors in their own right, but they are also met by Fingolfin himself, who is one of the all-time greatest warriors in the entire history of Middle-earth. I really can't overstate how badass Fingolfin is. And similarly, the orcs that go east are met by the cavalry of Maglor and the fury of Maedhros. In the last video we saw how Maedhros lost his right hand, and I feel like for most warriors that would be a devastating disability. But for an immortal like Maedhros, his amputation was simply an opportunity to become even more deadly with his left hand than he ever was with his right. So while some, other nameless elves mop up the scattered orc bands, the armies of Maedhros and Fingolfin unite on the battlefield from either side, and they descend upon the main host that's attacking Dorthonion. And so for the first time in the entire story, we see all 3 factions of the Noldor: the sons of Theanor, the sons of Finarfin, and the house of Fingolfin utterly unified. There's no resentment, there's no ill will, there's just an unstoppable union of Noldor, slaughtering orcs in concert. And we are told that within sight of Angband's gates, every single orc is utterly destroyed down to the least and last. This battle is forever afterwards known as the Dagor Aglareb, which translates as the Glorious Battle. It is an astounding victory for the good guys and an abysmal defeat for Morgoth. Seriously, the Dagor Aglareb is a game changer in the War of the Jewels. For the first time, the Noldor have a real position of strength over Morgoth. And it's true, they aren't able to invade Angband, and so Morgoth and the Silmarils are still beyond their reach, but from this moment, Morgoth is basically trapped inside his own iron prison. And what the Noldor are able to do is keep him there. They fence him in. Fingolfin orders the building of great watchtowers outside the gates of Angband, and they basically lay siege to Morgoth's fortress for almost 400 years. Now, that's not to say there's no fighting at all in that time. I'll do a whole video on what Morgoth and his servants are up to during the siege of Angband, but for a long time, it's happy days for our heroes. And I guess I could throw in some foreboding detail about some of the new evils being devised beneath the ground by Morgoth, but to be honest, you know what, I'm not going to. There aren't a huge number of happy endings in the First Age, so I'm not going to spoil this one. Today, all is good. And that's where I'm going to finish this video. But in the next one, we'll take a look at just how mighty the realms of the Noldor can be when there's no Dark Lord messing around in their business. And we'll also see the return of one of the Valar into the story, one of the gods who we've not seen in quite a while. So make sure you hit the subscribe button if you haven't already to ensure you don't miss that. And of course, hit the like button and leave a comment if you enjoyed this video. But as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy and navaer mellyn.